In the spring of 1910, a physician named Dr. Richard Cabot walked into a meeting at the Carnegie Corporation's offices on Fifth Avenue in New York City and left 2 hours later with a decision he spent the next 3 decades trying to undo. He was 40 years old. He was the chief of medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most respected clinicians in the country, and a man who had spent 15 years building a patient-centered practice that tracked outcomes with a rigor unusual for the era. He kept records, not the billing records that most physicians maintained. Actual outcomes. Whether patients recovered, whether the treatments he administered had worked, whether what he had been taught to prescribe had any measurable effect on the condition it was meant to treat. Those records, 4 bound volumes covering 1,600 patient cases from 1895 to 1910, were the reason he had been invited to the meeting. The man who had invited him was Abraham Flexner, a researcher employed by the Carnegie Corporation who had just completed a 346-page report on the state of American medical education. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Dr. Cabot's outcome records were examined. 3 weeks after the meeting, Cabot received a letter informing him that Massachusetts General Hospital's affiliation with Harvard Medical School would be restructured under new standards developed in response to Flexner's report. The outcome tracking program Cabot had built was described in the letter as methodologically inconsistent with the new educational framework. It was discontinued. The 4 bound volumes were removed from the hospital's record room. Dr. Cabot spent the following 30 years writing, speaking, and publishing about what he believed medicine had become. He died in 1939. His own outcome volumes have never been located. The official history of the Flexner Report describes it as the document that modernized American medicine, that swept away the fraudulent, the unscientific, and the dangerous, and replaced them with the rigorous laboratory-based training that produced the physicians of the 20th century. That account is not entirely wrong. What it omits is what was swept away along with the fraudulent and the dangerous. What it omits is that the Carnegie Corporation, which funded Flexner's report, had a specific interest in what the new medicine would treat, what it would not treat, and who would control the institutions that delivered it. What it omits is that Abraham Flexner had no medical degree, no clinical experience, and no background in patient outcomes. He was a former school teacher who had written one book, a critique of American higher education, before being hired to evaluate every medical school in the country. The 346-page report he produced visited 155 medical schools. He spent, on average, less than 1 full day at each. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what the Carnegie Corporation was building in 1910 and why a physician's outcome records were a threat to it, you have to go back not just a decade. You have to go back to 1847, the year the American Medical Association was founded, and to the 60 years of organized suppression that followed its founding. The AMA did not begin as a scientific body. It began as a guild, a professional association whose primary purpose was the elimination of competition. In the decades before 1847, American medicine was genuinely plural. Homeopathic physicians, eclectic practitioners, herbalists, hydrotherapists, and osteopaths all operated legally, all had schools, and all had patient populations who chose them based on results they had observed in their own families and communities. Some of these practices were ineffective. Some were dangerous. But the same was true of the allopathic medicine the AMA represented: bloodletting and calomel poisoning, practices that a Victorian-era physician could perform with full institutional approval. killed patients with documented regularity throughout the mid-19th century. The AMA's founding documents, available through the National Library of Medicine, are explicit about the organization's intent to establish a single standard of practice and to use licensing law to make any practice outside that standard illegal. The word used in those founding documents is irregular. Irregular practitioners. The language is bureaucratic. What it describes is the criminalization of competition. The standard being established was not chosen because it had better outcomes. It was chosen because it was the standard the AMA's founding members practiced. The outcome data to prove superiority did not exist. Dr. Richard Cabot, 60 years later, would try to build that data. His volumes were taken from him before the analysis was complete. The campaign to eliminate irregular medicine took 40 years and required a specific kind of ally. The AMA had professional authority but limited financial power. What it needed was an institution with the money to restructure medical education from the ground up, to close the schools that trained irregular practitioners, to fund only the schools that trained the kind of physician the new system required, and to do this in a way that would be received by the public not as the elimination of medical diversity, but as the advancement of science. That institution arrived in 1901 when John D. Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, the first institution in the United States devoted exclusively to biomedical research in the European laboratory tradition. It was not a hospital. It was not a school. It was a research institution whose findings would define what counted as legitimate medicine and what did not. Its founding director was a physician named Simon Flexner, the brother of Abraham Flexner, the man the Carnegie Corporation would hire 9 years later to evaluate every medical school in the country. That relationship, Simon directing the Rockefeller Institute while Abraham wrote the report that determined which medical schools survived, is a matter of public record. It appears in both men's published biographies. It has never been discussed in any official history of American medical education as though it represented a conflict of interest. Because the institutional actors who would need to make that observation are the same institutions whose funding traces back to the decisions those two men made together. Within 3 years of its founding, the Rockefeller Institute had established research relationships with 7 American medical schools. Within 10 years, through the Flexner Report and the Carnegie Corporation's funding mechanism, it had effectively determined the fate of all 155. The Flexner Report was published in 1910. Within 15 years of its publication, the number of medical schools in the United States had been reduced from 155 to 31. More than half of all practicing physicians in the country had been trained in schools that no longer existed. The schools that closed were not uniformly fraudulent. Many of them trained the only physicians available to rural communities, to immigrant populations in urban neighborhoods, and to Black Americans in the South, who, under Jim Crow, could not attend or be treated at white-serving institutions. Of the 7 medical schools in the country that trained Black physicians, 5 were closed in the decade following the Flexner Report. 2 survived: Howard University and Meharry Medical College. Both survived because they received Rockefeller and Carnegie funding. All 5 that closed received nothing. The Flexner Report's own text, in its section on these schools, described them in language that mixed racial condescension with procedural criticism in ways that later historians have noted, but that the report's official champions have rarely chosen to address. Abraham Flexner wrote in his assessment of Black medical education that the country needed Black physicians primarily to treat Black patients, and that the standard of training required could therefore be lower than that demanded of physicians who would serve the general population. That sentence, written in 1910 by the man whose report shaped the entire subsequent century of American medicine, remains in the original published document. It has not been removed. It has not been disavowed by the institutions that celebrate the report. It sits in the same text as the findings that every medical school in America is required to honor as the foundation of its accreditation. Before we move further, if this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, subscribe and ring the bell. We pull these threads every single week. If you've ever sat in a doctor's office and felt that something in the exchange was structured around something other than your recovery, you belong here. Dr. Richard Cabot, the Massachusetts general physician whose outcome records were discontinued in 1910, was not the only clinician who understood what was happening. In 1913, a physician named Dr. Emanuel Josephson, who had trained at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons and practiced internal medicine in New York, began documenting what he observed in the pattern of pharmaceutical recommendations coming through his hospital's newly restructured formulary. The formulary, the approved list of drugs a hospital physician could prescribe, had been standardized in 1911 under guidelines developed in consultation with the newly reorganized Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, a body that operated under the AMA but was funded, in substantial part, by the pharmaceutical manufacturing companies whose products it evaluated. This is not an allegation. The Council's funding structure was a matter of internal AMA record. It was described as a public-private partnership. What it meant in practice was that the body responsible for determining which drugs American physicians were permitted to prescribe was operated with money from the companies selling those drugs. Dr. Josephson's documentation of what this produced runs to more than 400 pages across 4 private journals that his daughter donated to the New York Academy of Medicine archive in 1972. In those journals, Josephson recorded case after case in which the formulary-approved treatment produced no measurable improvement in the patient's condition, while treatments he had observed to be effective in earlier practice were no longer available to him through legitimate channels. He described the hospital formulary as a purchasing agreement disguised as a scientific standard. That phrase appears in his journal entry for April 14, 1917. His daughter's donation included a note stating that Josephson had tried, on 3 separate occasions between 1920 and 1935, to publish his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. He was rejected each time without review. The rejection letters are in the archive. The 4 journals are in the archive. They have been there since 1972. They have never been cited in a published study of American pharmaceutical regulation. Philadelphia, 1910. A Carnegie-funded report eliminates 124 of 155 medical schools and removes outcome tracking from the new educational framework. New York, 1913. A Columbia-trained physician begins documenting formulary-driven prescribing patterns that produce no measurable patient benefit and describes the system in his private journal as a purchasing agreement. Washington, 1938. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is passed with provisions, inserted at the lobbying of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, that require all new drugs to demonstrate safety, but not effectiveness. Effectiveness standards would not be added to federal law until 1962. For 24 years, a drug could be approved for use on American patients without any requirement that it work. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are the dates of public laws, available through the National Archives. The absence of an effectiveness standard is in the text of the 1938 Act. It is simply not discussed in the history of medicine as though it were a designed feature rather than an oversight. The standard history of American medicine has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the Flexner Report, a document that determined the fate of every medical school in the country, was produced by a man with no medical training, no clinical experience, and no methodology for measuring patient outcomes. It is never explained why the 5 black medical schools that closed after 1910 received no Rockefeller funding, while the 2 that survived did. When the official justification for all 7 closures was academic quality rather than financial selection. It is never explained why the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, which set the prescribing standards for American hospitals, was funded by the same companies whose products it approved. Why would the institution that claimed to be advancing medical science remove outcome tracking, the only tool that can actually measure whether medicine is working, from the educational framework it designed? Why would a 346-page report that restructured an entire national profession be written by a man who had never treated a patient, if the report's purpose was to improve patient treatment? Why would the law that established federal drug oversight in 1938 require safety but not effectiveness? Unless effectiveness, proof that the drug actually heals, was something the system that lobbied for that law did not want to be required to demonstrate? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. But here is what makes Dr. Cabot's story different from every other account of suppressed medical evidence. In 1927, 17 years after his outcome volumes were removed from Massachusetts General Hospital, Cabot published a book called The Art of Ministering to the Sick, co-authored with a social worker named Richard Dix. The book is remembered, where it is remembered at all, as a philosophical work on the human dimensions of medicine. Its title suggests devotional literature. Its cover gives no indication of what the 3rd chapter contains. That is almost certainly not an accident. What the 3rd chapter contains is a compressed statistical account of treatment outcomes across a patient population that, by internal evidence, the range of conditions, the time period, the institutional setting, matches the data from the 4 volumes that were removed from Massachusetts General in 1910. Cabot had reconstructed them. He had kept private notes outside the hospital's record room throughout his years of practice. He had carried them home. He had carried them through the restructuring. And 17 years after the official volumes were taken, he published what they showed. Not in a medical journal where it could be rejected without review. Not in a political pamphlet where it could be dismissed as advocacy, but in the 3rd chapter of a quiet philosophical book with a title that sounded like a prayer. The statistical pattern he presents shows that for the most common conditions treated in American hospitals in the first decade of the 20th century, the treatments prescribed under the new pharmaceutical formulary showed no statistically significant improvement over no treatment at all. He did not editorialize. He did not name the system he was describing. He published the numbers and moved on to the 4th chapter. The book sold modestly. It went out of print in 1942. It has been reprinted once by a small academic press in 1984. It is not assigned in any American medical school curriculum. It has never been cited in any study of pharmaceutical efficacy. The numbers have been sitting in that 3rd chapter for nearly 100 years. No one was told to look. The hospital system that the Flexner Report built is still running. The formulary system that Josephson described as a purchasing agreement is still the mechanism through which American physicians prescribe. In 1974, the AMA's Council on Drugs, the renamed successor to the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry that Josephson had described in 1917, was disbanded after a congressional investigation revealed that pharmaceutical companies had provided direct operational funding for its activities. The function was not eliminated. It was redistributed to the FDA's Advisory Committee system, which operates under rules that permit pharmaceutical company employees and consultants to serve on the panels that evaluate those companies' own products, provided they disclose the relationship. The relationship is disclosed. The structure is unchanged. A man named Josephson recognized it in a journal entry in 1917 and called it a purchasing agreement disguised as a scientific standard. A Senate subcommittee named it in a hearing in 1971. The hearing produced a report. The report was filed. The system continued. Dr. Richard Cabot understood this in 1910. He spent the next 29 years trying to say so in a language the system could not easily suppress. He buried the numbers in a philosophy book. It is still there. It has always been there. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you've made it this far, you already know that the most dangerous question you can ask inside a system is whether the system is working. Not working for efficiency, not working for institutional prestige, working for the patient sitting in the room. Dr. Cabot asked that question and built 4 volumes of evidence toward an answer. The volumes were taken. He rebuilt what he could in private and buried it in a chapter where it waited for someone to look. Josephson asked the same question in 1913 and filled 4 journals over 30 years. The journals waited in a New York archive from 1972 until now. Subscribe and share this with someone who has sat in a waiting room and wondered, in a way they couldn't quite name, whether the building they were sitting in was designed around them. It was not. The documents say so. They have always said so. Next week, I'm following a 1922 internal memorandum from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research that describes, in the language of industrial planning, the projected market value of a population that requires chronic treatment rather than cure. The memo was not classified. It was filed in the Institute's own archive. It was cited once, in a 1971 Senate subcommittee hearing on pharmaceutical pricing, and then it disappeared from every subsequent published account of that hearing. The distinction it draws between a patient who is cured and a patient who is managed is 11 words long. You won't want to miss it.